Hello, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, Alex. This is Matthew and Alexandre from CYSAT, kicking off day 2 of CYSAT 2021. We had a full day yesterday, packed with speakers, panel discussions. We tackled cloud security, quantum technologies. How was that yesterday
Yeah,
for
it
you,
was
Alex?
awesome. I think we had a really interesting discussions. Some interesting points were raised. So yeah, I'm really looking forward today for new talks.
Yeah, today is going to be also very busy. This morning we'll be talking about ground operations data transmission and also a panel on the legal aspects of cybersecurity at the end of the morning. And first of all, with us this morning is James Pavur. He's a PhD candidate at Oxford University. If you have looked up, Googled cybersecurity, satellite hacking, you have come across James' research on VSAT hacking. We talked a lot yesterday about what exactly it means securing satellite communications, where James showed us exactly what are the weaknesses and how we can do better very clearly. His research has been making the headlines. It's got lots of attention from the media. So I'm sure you've heard his name before. We are absolutely excited and thrilled to have him with us this morning. I know a lot of people got their tickets because James was here. Also, I'm glad to have you, Alex, on my side for the Q&A because you'll also help me to ask James some interesting questions.
Yep. Definitely.
So I think he's ready. He's with us already. James, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, James.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Really excited to start today off. Hopefully it's interesting. So I'm James Pavur. I'm a PhD student at Oxford University where I research satellite cybersecurity. And today I kind of want to talk through some of the research I've done on VSAT systems and kind of what that's been teaching me about space cybersecurity more generally. So I think to start things off, it's good to think about how I started. And when I approached my PhD supervisor a few years ago, I came to him with a thesis proposal that looked an awful lot like this. The essential idea was I would find all kinds of cool vulnerabilities in a satellite with my elite hacker skills, and then they would give me a PhD diploma. Maybe something would blow up in between. It turns out that's not really how things work. I learned very quickly that actually hacking satellites is quite difficult. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that the equipment is really expensive. As a PhD student, I was on a fairly limited budget, and getting access to a satellite was kind of impossible. And even in terms of like representative components, being able to order that kind of stuff online is quite difficult. And then if you wanted to have anything that was interesting so you could find vulnerabilities in it, you often needed some sort of like business to business relationship. You couldn't just like order it from somewhere. On top of that, I found that the space world is very secretive. Some of this is a legislative thing. So you have things like ITAR restrictions that make it really hard to research rockets. But then you also have all kinds of kind of more cultural factors. The aerospace industry can be incredibly insular and hard to understand from the outside. There's a lot of language that people use, a lot of assumptions that people use based off of their like shared experience working on these big space projects that as an outsider trying to understand how to hack these systems or how they work, you don't necessarily have that kind of jargon on deck when you're getting started. Additionally, satellites are really diverse. So even once you are able to come over these other barriers and you find a system and you find a vulnerability in it and you're able to demonstrate it on representative hardware, the amount of traction you get out of that can be very small. Now, on the academic research side, what you want to do is find things that affect a lot of systems because then you can kind of make broader claims that are scientifically interesting or at least interesting in terms of their impact. As a hacker who's trying to harm systems, it's great to have a lot of systems you can affect because that means that the money and time you've spent developing your exploits ends up beneficial. And historically, since satellites have been so bespoke and built to mission purpose, this has been a real barrier for an attacker because you spend all of that resources to maybe be able to compromise 1 or 2 space missions, whereas the similar amount of effort on the ground could get you exploits in thousands of computer systems. Now, I didn't want to just give up when I came to this recognition. I wanted to see if there was anything I could do. And so we decided to start somewhere fairly simple, which was looking at satellite internet services and satellite broadband. In my case, this was a series of experiments that looked at VSAT internet services. For those of you who don't know, VSAT stands for Very Small Aperture Terminal. It's basically just a type of satellite internet service product that allows you to access internet, in our case, from geostationary satellites. And what we wanted to do is look at the radio emissions coming off of a bunch of geostationary satellites and then see if there was anything interesting in there from a security perspective. Now, we ran up against the first barrier fairly early on, which is that VSAT equipment can get quite expensive, especially because we were interested in kind of the more high-end side of the spectrum. So we're looking at kind of maritime operators or aviation operators who might have really interesting data in their networks. And in that context, you're costing tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And like I said before, you often need those special business-to-business relationships to get access to these sort of gear. However, for a variety of, I would say, almost cultural and political factors, these VSAT services tend to share radio spectrum with satellite television services. So in our case, we were looking at services in the Ku band of the radio spectrum, but you also see services in the C and Ka band that are very similar. And so we wanted to see how far some basic home television equipment could get us. We picked up a PCIe tuner card like this one on the screen behind me, which allows you to watch satellite television on your computer, is kind of the main market for these products. And then we also picked up just like a standard satellite dish in LNB, and we pointed it at a bunch of satellites. And we just wanted to see whether or not our card could find anything interesting. We ended up running into a second barrier pretty early on, which was that these systems are not very well documented. Nobody's out there saying, hey, this satellite here is the one with the interesting data, point your dish there, pointed at this frequency. So there was a lot of manual work in hunting down feeds, trying to find which signals we wanted to look for. Now, this is supported with a lot of open source intelligence, I suppose, things like footprint maps telling you which areas are covered by which satellite to help us kind of target our research. And then there's also software products that are used by feed hunter communities to look for satellite television channels. And these will essentially scan the radio spectrum and isolate channels that don't look like background noise so that we could delve deeper into them. Even then, even when we were able to find some channels that we were pretty sure were coming from some satellites, understanding what was going on inside that traffic was really difficult. Now, for those of you who work in this space, you may just look at me and be like, well, it's obvious that's a DVB-S2 connection with GSE encapsulation or whatever. But for someone coming from outside of the space community, that's just alphabet soup to me. I had no idea what kind of acronyms or protocols were relevant or what standards. And so there's a lot of reverse engineering. That secrecy was a big part of the cost here in trying to figure out what's going on. Eventually, we did tie a lot of these signals to one specific open protocol standard, the generic stream encapsulation protocol. And so we were like, great, now we sort of understand what's going on. We've been able to map it to this standard. Let's see what's inside. And then we ran up against that third barrier, which is that it turns out that standards are often treated as recommendations as opposed to law in this space. There were a lot of proprietary modifications to the format that made it complicated to write a parser. If you add to that the vast array of different modulation schemes for DVB-S2, it meant that our equipment was struggling to keep up with some of the higher bandwidth networks. And so we had tons of errors in our signal processing tools. And I kind of took a step back at that point and said, you know, unlike some of the people at this conference, I actually don't care all that much about reliability. I'm not building a satellite modem today. What I'm trying to do is find interesting information that an attacker might be able to exploit. And so we decided that good is probably good enough in this context. And we built a forensic tool that we call GSE Extract. And what it does is it tries to forensically reconstruct the easiest to find IP packets in these corrupted radio recordings we were getting. So it does that by looking for places where packets are like most likely to start or most likely to end and just extracting those. And this approach allowed us to get between 40 to 70% of the packets that were hitting our dish. And in practice, it looks an awful lot like this image behind me. So this particular image we intercepted from an engineer aboard a maritime vessel. He was communicating with his colleagues about a maintenance issue. And you can see that we were able to get this JPEG image, and GSE Extract is able to get kind of like the top chunk of that image. But eventually we missed a packet, and because JPEG is a compressed file format, we couldn't decompress the rest of it. So the question here is, what's interesting in that 40 to 70% of information we can get? And would it be enough for an attacker to do anything harmful? And we found that in practice, a lot of these networks were operating unencrypted. So the satellite internet service providers weren't offering any encryption to their customers. They were instead leaving it up to individual customers to decide whether they wanted to encrypt their data. And for whatever reason, customers weren't. So we saw all kinds of interesting and sensitive data. For example, we saw passport information from crew members aboard cargo vessels as they would pull into various ports and transmit that data to various authorities. We also saw personal communications. This image here behind me is an intercept from the captain of a Greek billionaire's super yacht when he forgot his Microsoft account password. So very deeply sensitive and interesting personal communication that's being broadcast across the entire continent of Europe and maybe even beyond. We saw navigational and kind of operational information affecting maritime vessels. So it turns out a lot of maritime ships will have these FTP file shares on board, which they use to update their nautical charts. And the file shares are unencrypted, so those passwords are being sent in clear text over the satellite feeds. And then they're also publicly routable over the internet. They have publicly routable IP addresses. And so it would be fairly trivial to try to upload some malicious files to put those on the navigational terminals aboard a vessel of some sort. We also saw on the aviation side of things some interesting traffic, some traffic from various systems on the plane, including a device that we call a femtocell, which is essentially a miniature cell tower that they put onto airplanes to let you use your smartphone on the plane as if you're on the ground. This screenshot here is part of an intercept from a passenger on a transatlantic flight when he received his negative coronavirus test result. Obviously a relief for people on the airplane, but really concerning for people who care about medical communications privacy. I think what's especially interesting here is that that passenger may have just forgotten to put their phone into airplane mode and not realize that that cell tower on the plane was being routed insecurely over a satellite backhaul at the next hop down. So Vincent, who's talking a little bit later today, is going to get into some of the weeds about work that we've been doing together, looking at how we can protect this information more effectively and what some of the underlying causes that are preventing people from encrypting traffic in these networks are. But I want to kind of take a step back and think about some broad lessons that this case study on VSAT internet tells us about securing satellites in general. So the first obvious question for me is, can we expect satellites to remain expensive? I was able to find this kind of loophole in the VSAT domain that allowed me to use very inexpensive equipment to do what would have otherwise seemed like a very sophisticated attack. And we see a similar kind of trend in the space industry towards a shift in the difficulty of getting access to equipment. So this screenshot in the back here is from EnduroSat, which is an online CubeSat store. You can buy CubeSat components or entire CubeSats for a couple tens of thousands of euros, which is really not all of that bad if you were a small state actor or a non-state actor with a decent budget. And we see generally a trend towards more open and inexpensive satellite hardware. We see open source satellite components like the CubeSat kit. And then on the ground, we see more capable things. This logo behind me for New Radio is for software-defined radios, which are really allowing attackers to communicate in chunks of the spectrum and with protocols that previously would have been cost prohibitive to play around with. So we're seeing kind of a shift in those costs that have acted as a historical protector of satellite missions. Likewise, there's a question about whether or not space systems will remain so secretive, so esoteric and hard to understand. This screenshot here is from the source code of Cubos, which is an open source CubeSat Linux distro. Although the source code is online and easily read. There are other open source systems like NASA's Core Flight System, which is available on GitHub, and I think actually has quite a bit of flight heritage at this point. And then we have all kinds of standards that are open from CCSDS and other standards bodies. And there's nothing inherently wrong with standards and open source systems. They can be very good, but if the security model of your system is kind of built around an assumption that no one can understand it, an open standard, when you choose to adopt that for various efficiency benefits or interoperability benefits, also changes your threat model. It makes it more possible for an attacker to understand what's going on. And so if obscurity was the only thing protecting your system, you need to be aware when it's going away. And in a lot of space missions, that shift is starting to happen. Finally, there's a question about whether or not space missions will remain so diverse, so different from each other and bespoke going forward. And we're seeing trends there as well. This screenshot is from Lockheed Martin marketing material. It's a fairly common idea in the space industry at this point. They call it a software-defined satellite, but you basically buy a satellite bus and then you just kind of plug in whatever components you need for your specific mission. If you find an exploit in that bus, as opposed to those components, you may be able to cause harm then to dozens of different space missions that rely on the same core platform. A similar effect might happen in the context of open source satellite operating systems like Kibos, which I mentioned before. If you find a vulnerability there, you could affect a whole range of space missions. And then we have these big mega constellations like SpaceX's Starlink, and those satellites, you have thousands of functionally identical satellites being launched. You find a vulnerability in one, instead of having just an exploit for a single satellite, you may have an exploit for dozens or hundreds of satellites. So I guess what we're seeing here is kind of an interesting general trend that's changing the way that space is being protected and the way it's being developed. And so if I wanted to kind of sum up a key takeaway, I think it's good to go back to the start of this talk, where I said that hacking satellites is really hard. Satellites are expensive, so it's hard to get equipment to find your vulnerabilities in if you're kind of a lone hacker or even a small organization. They're secretive and hard to understand. There's a lot of obfuscation, whether intentional or unintentional. And then they're all very bespoke and diverse, so it's hard to get a lot of traction from their exploits. But it turns out that I've spent more time near the space industry. What I've been realizing is that it's not hacking satellites that's hard for these reasons. It's actually basically anything to do with satellites is hard because they're expensive, they're secretive, and they're all different. And one of the big promises of new space, one of the reasons that it's so exciting, is that it's going to get rid of these barriers. It's going to make satellites more affordable and open and scalable. And that's wonderful. It makes it possible to do so much more with space than we've been able to do before, and for so many more people. But as we see these three defenses go away that have historically blocked hackers from attacking our systems, and we start to reap those benefits of scalability and low cost and openness, we also need to think about how we might need to update our security models and our understanding of space cybersecurity to address this shifting design pattern. And I think in that context, there's a different way we can talk about rethinking space cybersecurity. So one important recognition for me is that satellites are already constantly under attack, not from hackers, although that might or might not be true. Nobody tells me. But in the context of space, space is one of the most hostile environments I can think of. You have radiation, you have debris, you have thermal effects that are constantly trying to destroy your satellite. And even when you address all of that, even when you build a robust physical satellite, you have an incredibly hostile business environment. When you're convincing people to spend tens of millions of dollars on a project that's not going to see returns for a decade, there's a very low appetite for risk and a lot of concern when you're building these systems and a lot of risk adversity. And in that context, you can understand why cybersecurity historically hasn't won out. We have these more or less adequate historical defenses, like the cost of space missions, that have made the probability of a cyber attack against your specific satellite seem incredibly low. Meanwhile, you know with almost absolute certainty that the sun is going to be sending its deadly laser beams at your satellite 24/7. And so every dollar you spend dealing with the chance of solar radiation causing a bit flip or whatever is almost certainly seems like a more logical safety choice to make than to mitigate against the slight probabilistic chance of someone hacking your system. But that safety mindset for space systems is really deceptive. And I think one of the reasons is that, assuming everything goes well, the sun is going to be the same for our entire lifetimes. There's going to be the same kind of probability of these physical dynamics happening. There might be like minor shifts in the environment, but your threat model for solar radiation is always going to be the same. Attackers aren't like that. You can't look at 20, 30 years ago and say, over the past 30 years, the probability of a cyber attack against satellites has been this, and we can accept it. Because hackers can adapt. They can take advantage of these new design patterns, these new technologies, in order to change their strategies and target your systems in novel and interesting ways. And so as we dive into kind of this next era of space missions, it's good to think about whether or not your systems are currently protected by virtue of strong technical guarantees like cryptographic implementations or rigorous reviews, or if they're protected incidentally by domain features like cost and secrecy. And where they are protected by those domain features, thinking about how the changes in the technologies you're building into these systems interact with those protections is a really important way to understand why the threat may be different in 5 years than it was 5 years ago. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A session. You can also shoot me an email. And then if you're interested in some of the VSAT research I've done, I've got a much longer talk on like the radio stuff. from DEF CON this year, as well as a bunch of academic papers that you can find online. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. Wow, thank you. That was a lot of content.
Yeah, thanks, James, for an awesome talk. Yeah, that was
I took
really,
a lot of
really
notes.
interesting.
We have a couple of questions, so it's great that we have 10 minutes left for the Q&A. I'll just start to get a bit your opinion about this secretive versus open mindset and the benefits that it can bring to the space industry. Security by obscurity is something that comes naturally to mind, like you want to not show exactly what you're doing, so you think you will be better protected, but this is the opposite, right? What is your take on that, James, for the people that are not knowledgeable and not accustomed with the, let's say, other practices about security on other markets?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that within the hacker community, it's almost taken as a truism that security by obscurity is the worst kind of security. If someone
it's good that
like,
you mentioned it clearly, yeah, because it's not obvious. If someone is
like able to figure it out, right, you end up in a bad spot. So yeah, I think that that's a really, really good point to make, because security by obscurity seems to have been working for space, but I think that's more luck than anything else. It's just been that the returns from hacking satellites have been so low because of all these factors I've talked about. And going forward, you can try to rely on obscurity, but you need to be sure that you're actually obscure enough to give you the security you want. And that balance is incredibly, incredibly difficult to walk compared to just actually trying to find more provable systems for security.
Yeah. So we come back to the theme and to the topic that we discussed a bit yesterday about the culture. And it sounds like this is really what is missing today, and this is exactly the purpose of this event, is to start a little bit of the security culture in the space community. I do have one more question for you, and then we'll take the question from the chat. So to summarize, it's always interesting, especially for the threat model, to understand what is the level of efforts that took you to achieve these results. So I understood you basically started from scratch with basically no expertise in space whatsoever, and you started to investigate, do some reading, and so on and so on. So it took you about what, like 1 year, 2 years of full-time dedication on that, buying equipment, trying with the error and see if it works. What was the level of efforts to achieve these results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think someone more talented than me could have done it much faster, especially looking in hindsight. A lot of the stuff I did was, walking in circles and kind of just getting confused and lost at times. But it took me about 3 or 4 months to get the first bits of data off of these dishes. And that was really because I had some fantastic help from other people in the research community. Vincent's team, he's, I think, talking next, was really helpful in kind of helping me understand what's going on in these systems. And then there was a ton of work after that in making it usable at scale. So figuring out how to parse these protocols into packet capture files instead of just like looking at raw bytes on our computer. For example, that took a lot of engineering work and a lot more development. And so I'd say like probably 3 or 4 months before I was like really sure there was something interesting there. And then another year before I was able to actually understand how interesting it was.
And maybe a question for you, Alex. How does that compare versus when you're trying to profile the potential attackers? Somebody in 3 or 4 months that can get sensitive data. Are we talking about maybe not students, but non-state actors, or where do you put the gauge for this type of efforts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's also what I was talking about yesterday. So I think how to say the snooping on the downlink and like monitoring of downlink traffic is let's say the most interesting attack angle for the hackers and for the attackers. What I was interested in, I wanted to ask James whether, so of course VSAT we can consider it as a sort of legacy technology. So what is your take on let's say new space technology? You're speaking about CubeSats and well, some components which become more widely available. So do you think this kind of we will see this kind of, let's say, vulnerabilities of clear text traffic also going from the new satellites and new technology on the downlink?
That's a great question. I think that we've got a real chance to stop that from happening right now. And the hope is that events like this make it so that these new space providers take the step early on in their system design to get it right. That said, there's a huge temptation to use unencrypted traffic, especially when you're working with low budget satellites, CubeSats on tight deadlines. And you already have 18 months of compliance hurdles to get through before you can integrate it to a rocket. Do you really want to add another 6 of security review? And so I think that there's going to be a lot of temptation in the industry to do things insecurely, but it's my sincere hope that they don't.
And just again to rephrase to all the space engineers watching the event, so by making your system open for people to review, you make it more secure, right? This is the big takeaway and the big message to send to the new space community. Do you agree with that, James?
Yeah, 100%. I think that when you design a system, you should build it on the assumption that someone knows exactly how it works as well as you do, if not better, and then be able to confidently say, despite that, it's still secure. And that's just a different way of thinking about security than you normally would, especially if you're kind of just coming from an intuitive angle or from experience with other things that need to be secure. Like when you're trying to deal with like classified systems, you keep the classified systems a secret so that the other side doesn't know about them. But when you're dealing with cybersecurity, you should assume the other side knows everything and then still be able to have security guarantees.
Maybe I'll take just one question from the chat. So, of course, I mean this kind of vulnerability is quite amazing, where you can see things or passwords going in clear text.
The examples were.
Yeah. So the question is like whether you warned or you were discussing with VSAT providers and about this kind of risk and vulnerability, and what was their reaction or response?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the DEF CON talk I have has like a much longer chunk about our responsible disclosure than I'll be able to get into right now. But we did reach out to satellite operators. We've been talking to internet service providers for well over a year now from our first disclosure contacts. And generally, the people we spoke to were very receptive. We also reached out to some of the big companies, so like people whose data that we saw and we thought this is really concerning, this is a Fortune 500 company that should know about this. And they were especially receptive, I think because they're from industries that are more used to security researchers. We had 1 or 2 people get a little bit threatening about, whether or not we were allowed to be doing this research, but I think that we were able to compellingly make the case that it's in their interest as well as ours to be able to find these issues before someone who's much less ethical or more likely to exploit them and abuse their customers does.
Sure. Yeah, I think I completely agree. So, and what do you think? Because for me, the thing is like for this VSAT service providers is a bit like asking my ISP to to encrypt my traffic, because of course if I send a traffic and encrypt it from to a mail server or whatever service I contact, I mean, it's a bit my responsibility that, the traffic, so it's not the responsibility of ISP. So what's your take on that? Is it really the responsibility of VSAT service provider to do some, let's say, put some layer of encryption, or they can say, look, it's your traffic, it's your responsibility to encrypt it?
So I personally think that because of the way that satellite communications operate, because of the size of those footprints and the fact that they cover, tens of millions of square miles, there's a higher duty of care than you would expect if you were just managing a fiber optic line for a customer or something. But I don't know if that's a legally mandated thing or just like a personal belief that the ISPs should be protecting their customers in this context. That said, I think it's also important to give customers the tools to protect their traffic. Vincent will talk a little bit about why that's a hard problem and not easy. Like a customer saying, I want to encrypt all of my traffic for satellite is actually really hard to do without having some performance issues. But I think a mix of both. So customers should be aware, and if you're a big customer, one of those maritime companies or whatever, you should probably be actively encrypting your traffic everywhere. But then ISP should also recognize that they are shouting people's data across an entire continent, and there's a different obligation when you do that.
Yeah.
Completely
Good
agree.
question for the legal panel later this morning. One question from the chat, somebody was puzzled with the fact that you're able to listen to Outlook and Microsoft data. What about SSL and TLS? Did it get lost in the way or?
Great. So yeah, the data that we saw that were emails were often from people who are using insecure email protocols, I think probably to download emails onto their phone or legacy devices. So think like just a regular POP server or something. There was a lot of SSL traffic that does protect the contents. You could still use it to like fingerprint someone's web browsing history because the certificates tell you which websites they're visiting. But SSL and TLS everywhere is a really good step towards just like generally protecting customers and their data.
Great. It's almost time to wrap up and go to the next speaker, who is Vincent. I'll just also finish on my side to mention that as part of CYSAT 2022, we want to couple it with a hacker competition, a bit similar to what the US Air Force did at HackerSat. So James, we would be extremely happy to welcome you next year at CYSAT to try to actually spend a couple of days in hacking on the actual satellites.
Yeah, we'll see what we'll do.
It sounds like so much fun, yeah.
I mean, it's not easy, and I know what it takes to organize this kind of competition, but we'll try to, yeah.
We'll have an open call for sponsors and people that are ready to invest a bit of time and create challenges. We could chat with you, James, for a long time, but it's time to go. We would like to thank you again. Thank you for being part of CYSAT. Thank you for the great talk. I think you're on the platform, so I encourage also people in the chat, if they have questions, to try to get in touch with you directly. And thanks again.
Thanks, James.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Awesome talk.
Thank you so much, James.